live. We had a bit of a technical snafu, but as usual, I rescued the whole project and saved the day with my technical expertise. So today, for your listening pleasure, we have Brett the Atheist, and perhaps we will hold true to the title of the video, Destroy Him. Brett, would you like to introduce yourself and say who you are and why you are here?
Sure. My name is Brett, or Pleasure of Doubt, as I go online. I guess call me an atheist, a weak atheist or an agnostic, but I have a big interest in helping, sort of bridge between different groups, helping people have, figuring out a way how to get past the us versus them dynamics that lead to sort of garbage fire style discussions where people just fall into these old traps of discourse. And yeah, I've got a small YouTube channel that I've just started and hoping to grow it slowly. And yeah, that's me.
Why grow it slowly? Let's grow big.
Oh,
let's go big.
Let's get it out there. Let's get it out there.
Well, okay. So you're
viewers.
and we're also, you and I are engaging on a mutual project that we will discuss a little bit on air and mostly off air for the time being. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to be discussing is it your pet project? Is it the raison d'etre for your YouTube channel to foster more productive conversations, would you say?
Yeah, I would say that it's to sort of give guidance that, I think I've been on the internet a long time. I've had a lot of discussions. I think I've noticed some patterns that I think often get in the way of people having productive conversations that I see over and over again. So I've tried to figure out ways to get around that, to control for the difficulties. And I think I've had some anecdotal success on my own, in having my own productive conversations with people where I've seen people have unproductive discussions with other people, and I've been able to get somewhere with them.
And you've been able to enter into the conversation, analyze it on the spot, and diagnose the problem and smooth it out. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So sometimes I've been able to have a mediation style, role where I could, I could sort of see, often people, they react fairly uncharitably to others, and I can sort of see how they're misinterpreting each other. And I can sometimes get in there and say, well, I think this is what this is what this person is saying. What do you think of that? And it can kind of calm things down and get things back on track. Okay, on the other hand, I've also had my own productive discussions where I've been able to have like just one-on-one discussions where I've been able to get a lot further than I've seen other people get. And it's not because, it's because of, I think, the methods that I use, I think help do that, help facilitate that.
Okay, so let's cut right to the chase. So we're just going to go right for the substance of the conversation, right? We're going to talk about you put out a video. We're just going to jump right to it, right?
Sure.
Okay, so you put out a video and you have things that you've observed. I'll give you one of my pet observations about why productive conversations bog down, get unproductive, particularly between atheists and Christians. And then you can give me a breakdown of general thing on yours. One of the things that I always call is the zero-sum conversation. The zero-sum conversation is a winner and a loser. If I'm right, you're wrong. If I have this conversation, a lot of these conversations between Christian and atheists are zero-sum, where somebody walks away, the winner of the conversation, someone walks away, the loser of the conversation. That automatically leads to an unproductive conversation, because you have to be, turns it into a competition right away, and you have to defend your position publicly 100 times out of 100, or you walk away the loser. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the way I would put that is, I think I like to foster what I call discussion over debate. So, a debate is we each have our sides and we have to stick to our sides, and, come hell or high water, we're just advancing our point of view. Often in debates, each side isn't really talking with each other. They're talking at one another. They have their prepared comments. They've had these conversations often, hundreds, if not thousands of times before. And they have their talking points.
Right.
And so one thing I like to do is say, well, we're not going to have a debate. Let's have a conversation, a discussion. and it's a mutual exploration. So we each have our point of view. So the point is not, it's not to push your point of view. That's part of it, but to do it in an exploratory way, so that we're each presenting our views, we're each challenging one another on our views, and I say let's work through the issues rather than just put our, let's treat it as if we're working through these issues rather than we're just advancing our issues, and that gives you a bit of, a lot of it's about reducing bias. I think when we have a bias towards our own point of view, and that's just normal. Everybody does that. Now, when you frame it in terms of exploring your view, I think it helps relax some of that hold that we naturally have. So when you explore your view, your whole idea is to press on it, to push on it, to test it, to see where it goes. And I think it can relax each side to say, hey, I don't have to just stick to my view per se. I'm going to be open to them. They're going to be open to me as much as we can, and try to sort of have a mutual process.
So how does this work in terms of, part of the reason why the conversations get bogged down between Christian and atheists is there is some zero sum at play. There is some, if I'm right, you're wrong. That's sort of a subtext of the entire conversation. So how do we, that made sense, right? How I just said that?
Yeah.
How do we avoid that?
So I just released a video that I called my 5 criteria for what makes a productive conversation. And level 1. So this is a set of 5 different criteria, each building on the other, that lets us say this was a productive conversation. Level 1 is the parties leave better understanding one another. So if you go into a conversation saying, one of my main goals here is to come out better understanding the other, then that in itself, I think, makes a productive conversation and avoids that problem that you just said. Because if
okay, so let me back that up. Let me back that up, and then let's challenge that. Is that fair?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so how that works in the real world is that's one of the things that I had in mind when I was having atheists come on my YouTube channel. And for example, with like genetically modified skeptic, I don't have atheists on my channel to challenge their atheism. I have them on the channel to find out, to gather information. How did you deconvert? Why? What were the circumstances? To try and learn as much about them in the course of an hour and a half, 2-hour period as I can. Not necessarily to challenge, maybe ultimately to challenge them, but in the short term, not at all. How do you, here's where we'll push back on it though. I'm pretty sure you'd agree that that's the right approach, correct? According to what you just said.
Although I'm not against challenging from the start, but it should be a mutual challenge. And, one of the problems you get often is it's sort of one side grilling the other, and that can often seem like an unpleasant. The person on the receiving end doesn't always feel that that's a very fair way to proceed, and can sometimes get bitter about that. Well,
you get defensive immediately because
right.
When you're on the receiving end of that behavior, you understand automatically that you are being played, that the person isn't listening to you and doesn't really care what your answers are. They're just trying to lead you to their precept. They're trying to accomplish something with you as the sub. They're not really listening to you. So that's the first thing that you notice.
And so if the parties, for example, are going in saying, one of my main goals here is to better understand each other, then they will care about what's being said, because their goal is to care about what's being said, or at least understand what's being said, so that, but it's something you have to go in on purpose. Productive discussion is really hard. It's easy to have, the standard, just go in attacking and not really listen and just say your points. And as soon as you hear a keyword, go, haha, I got you. That's easy. And that's why you have people do these things over and over again. To really have a productive discussion, I think both parties need to go in together. So, often I think it'll involve a discussion beforehand to say, when I'm setting up these kind of discussions, I'll say, listen, I don't want to have a debate. Let me tell you what my idea is for going through this discussion. Let's decide in advance, this is what we're going to do. So you need both parties to say, yeah.
So you're laying a groundwork so that the person feels safe and doesn't feel like their ideas are going to be taken under assault. What's different about you, and this is just personal observation, is that you actually mean it. A lot of people say that, but when push comes to shove and you're on their channel, they say, oh, it's going to be simple. I'm just going to ask you what you believe and why you believe it. And you're like, oh, it sounds fun. And then when you're on when you're on the receiving end of them, it's a grilling, and they throw their ideal of what they think their conversation is going to be about out the window in the real world. That's
Well, because
one thing.
it also takes practice, right? It's like I said, it's hard. I think, and that's why I'm sort of making this video series and making this channel to try to put these. I mean, some of the tips that I have are tips that have gone around that a lot of people heard. Some I think are sort of new, or at least packaged in a way that I think I've sort of cobbled together. But I think you have to have these things in mind and practice them over and over and over again. I've been working on these techniques for years. So I have, at least in my own conversations, I have a lot of it down pat, especially in the written ones. It's when you get to talking, these are hard because it's about, a lot of this is about controlling your own biases. And if you don't have this stuff in mind sort of at all times, if you're not practicing it, it's easy to fall back into, the unproductive sort of us versus them back and forth.
Right. Well, okay. So the one question I have about what we've talked about so far is, I get how I can ensure that I'm entering into the conversation in good faith and just trying to explore with, the atheist or the person who disagrees with me. How do you ensure that the other person is doing the same thing? And that's, how is there a way to do that?
I don't think you can ensure, because they're their own person, and you obviously can't control them. What you can do is try to, one thing I found is that if I just start showing the other person that I'm engaging with them, that I'm listening to them, I think they relax. So I think they start to relax. I've got one tip in my next video is going to be on tips to help achieve productive conversation. One tip I have is engage to avoid rage. That by most of the time, like you said, people are just talking at each other. They're not really listening. They don't care with what you say. If you respond to somebody in a way that shows them that you did understand what they said, or you heard them, or you're working on trying to understand them, I think it often instantly changes how they react to you, because people aren't used to that. A lot of the time they're used to just the stereotypical from both sides, whether you're on the atheist, non-religious side, or the theist side, or whether you're in politics, or I mean, these type of communication problems are people problems. It's not, it goes.
Oh yeah, they're around the boards, and they actually, there's like I pointed out the last time you were on the channel, my wife and I don't agree about anything on politics. We almost never argue because it's really easy for me to get inside of the other person's worldview and discuss it from their point of view without compromising myself. Really easy for me to do. Like it's natural to me. Like I'll go with them as far as I can. Do you know what I mean? And I've noticed that it's pretty easy for you to do the same thing. That's part of the reason, like, as far as my observation about you, it seems to be a natural thing for you to do too. Would you say that that's true?
It is, but only because I've worked at it really hard, and I'm sure you have too. And I think from what I've seen from you, you have too. I've worked at it hard, very consciously over years. And I've had my time where, I, for example, I'm a little better than some people at. I'll have somebody says something off, and you're like, ah, and you feel that need to respond. I've become good at typing something out and then not sending it. And sometimes I still give in and I send it. And I'm like, why did I send it? I know what's going to happen. And it still does. But, I've been good at controlling that. I have the same instincts as everybody. I think we all have these instincts, but I think I've gotten better at controlling some of them.
Well, just the word we use, triggered. Triggered means something has touched something inside of you, and you feel this impulse to either tweet really quickly or shout really quickly or get in their face really quickly, because it's poked a button inside of you. And we even use the words that explain what's going on. Someone has pushed your buttons. We all have these deep-seated emotional responses to things that my wife, for example, is literally an expert at pushing my buttons, staying calm and saying just so saying the inflammatory thing, just so that I start getting like, ah, and then when I start getting
my ex-wife is the same, so I can
right.
relate. But
Yeah, I mean, but it's
you
natural.
kept yours
You
together.
get to know somebody.
Yeah.
I if I wanted to, I could say really inflammatory, like terrible things to my wife too. And I do once the conversation has degenerated into pure fight, because then it becomes, there's a point past which dialogue becomes impossible because your
Sure.
emotions get too heated, and
Right.
then you're just fighting to punch, to hurt, to win, to
Well,
shut down. Go ahead.
Well, that's in a lot of the tips that I have, I think, are geared at preventing those emotional triggers, because that's it. Once you trigger them emotionally, they're no longer focusing on your argument. They're just focusing on the perceived insult or whatever emotion has been raised. But you talked about, how do you ensure the other person does it? One of the things I'm trying to do is just show people as a proof of concept that you can have these conversations. And I've had some conversations with people online, and they said this was the first time they'd had a good back and forth, a productive back and forth between someone from the opposite side. Like they'd never had it. People aren't used to it. So we have to give people a bit of a break. We have to be, I think, understanding. A lot of people are just used to the standard internet type of discussions. There was a debate last night between SJ and Skylar Fiction, which I think showed a lot of, we could talk about that maybe later, a lot of the
we can definitely talk about that.
Telltale signs of an unproductive discussion.
Yeah, well, go for it. Let's take it into the real world. And if either of you are listening, we love both of you. We're not trying to jerk. We're not trying to be unproductive in our analysis. But go for it. Let's take it to the real world so we can go. For example, this, because part of the reason. Wait. Let me just, before you start. Part of the reason why we have a project coming up that will address, maybe not on this particular stream, but part of the reason why I wanted to start with this is that you and I already have a pretty good working rapport. And when you have a good back and forth rapport, Brett and I are also in a stream that I'm in charge of, that I lead on another channel about these discussions with John Vervaeke, that I'm the leader of, sort of.
Sort of in a not sort of way, but yeah.
Okay, so I show up every once in a while for 40 minutes, say stupid stuff, and then walk away. You and I already have a good working rapport. The point of a good working rapport is to go someplace, to start getting into like the real, like that seems to be easy for both of us. So let's dig into some of the, why was it unproductive in your analysis, and go ahead. Do you see what I'm saying?
Sure. So first of all, one thing they structured it as a formal debate. Now there's a role for formal debates. I think they can be useful, but in terms of productive discussions, if you want a real back and forth discussion, productive discussions aren't really the best way. But I think during that debate, what I noticed is there was a lot of talking at each other. They each had their prepared statements, which again, you can't fault them too much. It's a prepared debate, but there didn't seem to be, from what I could see, there didn't seem to be any much real back and forth. I know Skylar was pretty frustrated, and he got into, I probably, I agree with him more than I don't know. I only listened to it once, so I'm more on.
Well, there's a lot of things that in Skylar's position that I noticed that atheists are very inclined to assent to. He'll start bringing up the atrocities of the Old Testament. I'm relatively certain that you go, oh yeah, totally. The Bible says that. He's right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I saw the point he was making. I thought he could have probably brought the point. I think he framed the point in disproving God, but I think what he meant to do, what he was trying to do, was say, because there's this contradiction in God's morality, God can't be the foundation of any objective morality. I think that's what he was sort of trying to get at, but he didn't say it. But I'm not talking about in terms of his arguments. I'm talking about, so there was one point where there was a question and answer period, for example, and Skylar got into this mode, sort of an aggressive mode, where he was just saying to SJ, answer yes or no and nothing else.
Everybody bristled at that.
Yeah, she wanted to go into more detail, but also, you also had SJ on the others. Now, I thought SJ was quite reasonable to want to go into detail. That being said, SJ also, I think, on her own side, wasn't quite directly answering the question and was trying to go off into, and I think because I don't think she was being dishonest, I think sometimes there's cognitive dissonance that can get involved. Often, when, and this is one of my tips down below too, that often we don't, we don't directly answer we only directly answer the questions that we feel comfortable with, and we avoid the ones that we don't feel comfortable with. And I think part of having a productive discussion is to recognize that cognitive dissonance in oneself and to say, this
Right,
is
but
an
okay,
area.
so the challenging question though is, because part of the reason why it happens is these are, the famous adage, don't talk about religion or politics, because those are where people's emotions, deeply held convictions, get touched on in the course of the debate or the conversation or the discussion. How do we have a productive conversation when we're specifically dealing with those things? You see what I'm asking?
If I had been moderating that conversation, I think I would have stopped them much more often when I saw the disconnects. And I know James, I like James. He's a really nice guy. I think he takes often a very hands-off approach to moderation.
Yeah, that's the whole point, is let them work it out. Let them fight.
Right. What I'd like to do on my channel and my discussions, because I'd like to have some discussions where I moderate people, June, I would have said, okay, let's just stop. Let's nail down for example, what really is the question that Skylar's asking, and SJ, I want you to go into as much detail as you need to, but can you make sure that you're at least directly answering the question, and then go into whatever detail that you need. Part of the problem is, people often just focus in on keywords. They don't really make sure they understand. They don't really make sure that they've understood what the other person is even saying. So one thing I'll say is, and this is pretty common sense, other people will say this too, but try to repeat back the other person's position just in a way that they agree, to make sure
what we're now calling steel man.
Right, steel man. Well, I'm not even talking about steel. I mean, I guess that is sort of steel manning, but I'm not even talking about presenting it in the best point of view. I'm just talking about make sure you can make sure that you
understand what they're saying. Make sure you're listening to the actual sentences that are coming out of the mouth, and not misrepresenting what they're saying. Let me just put, before you continue, just in the interest of fairness, I think Stephanie thought that the debate was going to be about objective morality, and then
sorry, you cut out there, Craig.
Oh, I think Stephanie thought the debate was going to be about, do objective morals exist? And am I cutting out again?
You're still gone.
Am I gone?
I can hear you, Craig. Can you not hear him, Brett?
Brett, can you hear? Listening. He can hear me. He's just not. He just doesn't want to.
He's just faking it. Nah.
Yeah, I knew it.
I think he's recording.
There we go.
All right.
I just got something saying my internet connection's unstable, so hopefully I won't cut out next.
Stephanie thought that the debate was going to be about, do objective morals exist? And then Skylar shifted it into the familiar territory of the Old Testament atrocities. And I don't think she wanted to debate that. So that was a tense thing right from the start.
I mean, frankly, I don't think either of them quite discussed the topic. Well, at least not in a way where they really defended it. Here's how I would have started that discussion. I would have first started with a discussion of, what does it mean to be objective? What does objectivity mean? Do we both mean the same thing by the word objective? So and do we both mean the same thing by objective morality? Because if we mean different things by it, then we're going to be talking past one another for the entire conversation. So it's critical, I think. It's maybe a little bit boring, but it's critical to start a discussion by confirming your terms. Make sure you know that you're talking about the same thing. Otherwise, you can't have a productive discussion. I don't know if they each had the same definition of objective. I suspect.
Well, that starts to get that's with this particular. Let's move from this, because that starts to get really complicated with that. Because people have different definitions of objective, and then you can get bogged down into just debating that.
But I hear you. But I mean, and this is why I say it can sort of be annoying and a little bit boring. But if your goal, listen, if your goal is to have an entertaining debate for people to just watch and
Then mission
each
accomplished,
cheer
because that
on.
was fun to watch.
Yeah.
That was fun
Right,
to watch.
right. So what I'm talking about is if you want to actually have a productive discussion, and for that you've got to give up a little bit of the drama to do that, because you can't have a productive discussion if you mean different things by the words you're using. It's impossible. You're having two different discussions. So you're by definition, no pun intended, you're not going to be on the same page.
Right,
So
you're talking past each other.
right. So it's critical. Now
So
just,
how would that? Okay, but let's take it away from Stephanie and.
well, wait, hold on.
Scott.
Let me just say one last thing on that.
Sure.
I'm not saying, like, I agree with you that you can get away with you and you can have a debate over definition. So here's my solution for that. Either there's two. One, either accept one definition for the sake of the argument for that discussion, or just say, let's analyze it first under my definition, and then let's analyze it under your definition. And so just use your definition of objective morality, my definition of objective morality. And even if you're not quite on the same page, you're at least on the same page with what the other person's saying. And maybe through that process, you'll actually get to be on the same page. You'll realize the pros and cons of each of your definitions as you go through.
So how would that work try and think of a real world, not those two specifically, because I don't want to make this personal, but try and think of a real world example of Christian atheists, where a conversation that you've seen get bogged down 1,000 times, and how you would structure it differently.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the standard one that I see over and over again is the arguments over the definition of atheism, right? Where you have,
that was awesome.
Which,
oh my God, that one's awesome, dude. You're gonna like ruin Twitter for everybody. I think
it's like, so, I mean, I've had these conversations hundreds of times over the years, and people are still having these conversations hundreds of times. I've bowed out for most of them. My solution is pretty simple. There are two standard commonly accepted definitions of atheism, one being the lack of belief, one being belief no deity exists. Then there's the strong atheism, weak atheism, which have them both, and they're both accepted in various circles. As long as you're clear on which one you're using, it doesn't really matter. It shouldn't really matter which one you're using. So if you're talking to somebody who says, for me, atheism just means lack of belief, and you understand that's what they mean, okay, say, okay, I understand that's what you mean. Now let's get on with the conversation.
But that's generally the lack of belief is more a colloquial definition. And the king of debating that, Steve McRae, acknowledges that it's a colloquial definition. And usually he's not necessarily challenging that, is that the other person is trying to force him to shift the philosophical definition from the philosophical definition. Like, that's generally the breakdown of those two. One's a colloquial definition that's been popularized by the atheist experience and other atheists. So atheists automatically use it. All atheism means.
Well, I know that lack of belief definition was the first one I learned, before that. And then I learned the breakdown of weak atheism and strong atheism, so to me, when I first learned the word, I mean, I think I lost my belief before even learning the word, but when I first heard the terms, it was weak atheist and strong atheist. So weak atheist was a lack of belief atheist, and a strong atheist was a belief there is no God atheist. And to me, that was pretty simple. I just said I'm a weak atheist, and that was easy. There are some people who are not aware of the fact that there are two different definitions, and Steve, unfortunately, in his way, is always somewhat aggressive, and he's not always. I get what he's saying, but he doesn't always frame it in a way that's easy to get that message across. Sometimes, even though I know because I've heard his position over and over, I've seen him frame it in ways that are seem a little more stringent, and where he's saying, no, this is what atheism believes. And then, really what we just need to do is break and say, okay, there are two definitions. Here's why I think one definition is better. And I've tried.
But here's the problem. Here's one of the potential problems with what you're talking about. And it's not a problem with every conversation. It's just this particular one. is because the weak definition that all atheism means is a lack of belief in God. There's a hidden reason why people are motivated to use that definition. And if they're having a conversation in good faith, fine. But the rest of the conversation has to be in good faith if they're going to use that definition, because a lot of times they're using it to duck, to not be accountable to the person on the other side of the conversation, to constantly reassign the burden of proof so that they don't ever have to answer and they can have an easier time. Now, I let it happen, but that's a lot of times what's actually going on underneath the surface. There's a subtext there that isn't quite on the surface. Go ahead.
And here's a problem that, I think often, I think what you've just done, I think often is one of the reasons why that conversations go off. And it's about the assuming of bad faith and the assuming of subtext and reading in premises.
No, but I'm not assuming. Wait, you're misinterpreting, because I'm not assuming. I am observing, and I've seen that bad faith in action. I've observed it, and I know it's there.
Okay, but let me go.
I don't say you. See, the reason why you and I can do this is because you almost never operate in bad faith. Almost never. Maybe never, but almost never at least. Other people, I've seen them. I've observed them doing it. It's not me assuming they're going to do it.
No, I know what
I've seen them
what you're
actually
talking
do it
about.
and go, wait a minute, this guy's scamming. You know what I'm saying?
So I hear where you're coming from, and I know the phenomena that you're talking about, and I've even been a part of it at times back when I got involved in the atheism definition of atheism arguments. At one point, I just started calling myself a non-theist, and I think no one has a problem with non-theist. when I say non-theist, no one bats an eye.
I do.
Okay, well we can have that conversation. That's probably a good conversation, but up until this moment, no one seems to have a problem with non-theists.
John does too. Me and John both have a problem with it.
But well, that's a good conversation we'll have. So, but here's the thing. So there's two things going on with this definition of atheism. One is, what do people think is the definition of atheism, and then what do they think the implications of this are? Okay, back in I think it was the early 1970s. I was born in 75, so I think it was just before I was born. I think it was 74. Anthony Flew wrote a paper where he basically made popular this lack of belief definition, and he definitely had political reasons for doing it. He wanted to broaden out the number of people who would fall under the atheist label, and so he said we should make this popular, and other groups, some atheist groups, took that on. Now I don't think that's necessarily in bad faith. He said aloud.
No, he said what he was going to do, and he offered that this is a political thing.
Right.
So,
but let me just. So my point isn't that. So back then, I wish he hadn't done that, because I think it's caused a whole lot of unnecessary arguments, and I don't think there would have been a problem just having atheists and agnostics, for example, in a joint group. Because the definition doesn't change our interests. Whether I call myself an atheist, a weak atheist, or an agnostic doesn't change my interests. My interests are the same. My interests are, and weak atheists and strong atheists are aligned on a lot of things, and agnostics and atheists are aligned on a lot of things, regardless of what you call them. But so I wish he hadn't done it, but he did do it. And like I said, when I grew up and I learned the definition of atheism, I learned the lack of belief. Most people today were not involved in that political movement to reframe the definition of atheism.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So they're not actually operating in bad faith, even though I get where you're going. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. They've just been taught through the, I learned through podcasts. It was when I got my first iPod, and suddenly I discovered iTunes, and I suddenly had all these, I got into some atheist and skeptical podcasts, and it spread through, and I learned all sorts of everyone was talking about the definition of atheism as this. Now, the burden of proof thing is something different. And that burden of proof thing is going to be there whether you call yourself an atheist or agnostic. I think people misunderstand the burden of proof. The burden of proof for a lack of belief atheist is to demonstrate that their lack of belief belief, I keep on getting tripped over these lack of belief is reasonable and backed up. I have reasons for my lack of belief. It's not just because I'm not somebody who's never heard of these arguments before. I've heard of the arguments. I've been exposed to the arguments. For me to say I have a lack of belief more than, and not a belief there are no gods, is the only thing I can say, because I don't think there's sufficient reliable evidence to warrant belief in a god, but neither do I think there's sufficient reliable evidence to warrant belief that there are no deities. Neither have been established to a sufficiently reliable point of view. So I have to use a lack of belief if I'm being honest. So it's not about avoiding a burden of proof. It's what describes my position, because I think it's just as irrational to say, or just as not justified, I should say, more than irrational, to say that no deities exist. I can't make that case. I can't make the case no deities exist. I may be able to make the case there are contradictions with certain.
All right, so let me try and think of a clearer example of bad faith and see how you solve this.
Sure.
Because I kind of get what you're saying in this, and I guess I agree that most people aren't adopting the label, a lack of belief label, on purpose in a way that's disingenuous. It's the label that they've watched all the shows and it's gotten inside of them as the definition, and it's just sort of I get it. I kind of get where you're coming from with that, and it's not something I really want to get bogged down into.
Sure.
So let's do one that's actually more real. A lot of times an atheist will misappropriate a talking point that makes complete sense in one context and use it in a different context so that it's totally nonsensical. Do you understand what I mean, first of all? Let's talk about our definitions. Let's get our definitions.
I think people on all sides do that. I mean that's right.
But you can use a Christian example too. But
yeah, and
to me,
for
it's
example,
being done semi-consciously.
A lot of this stuff is done semi-consciously, but not purely like. I think, okay, there are bad faith actors. Don't get me wrong. There are people who go in looking to manipulate, and that's no question. But I still think more often than not, and this is where the principle of charity comes in, more often than not, it's bias which leads to these things. That people, because you have to remember, people have their own biases in favor of their own beliefs. They have confirmatory biases where they confirm the hits and they forget about the misses. There's selection biases. They will, in their own mind, sometimes latch on to something and believe it supports their case and ignore the things that don't support their case. Now, some people may do this in a manipulative manner, but most of the time it's their bias. Now, here's the thing. Think about the difference between going in a conversation and treating them as if they're in bad faith versus treating them as if they have biases, which we all have, and let's see if we can work through the issue, test it. And listen, once you accuse somebody of bad faith, the conversation's basically over. If your goal is to have productive discussion, that kills the discussion. It's just like calling somebody a liar, right? It triggers the emotions. Most people, I think, don't see themselves as being in bad faith.
Right. No, I totally understand that. There's a complication here that I'm trying to elucidate. Maybe bad faith is the wrong thing for me to be using. But for example, you've heard the talking point about the Spider-Man. What's the Spider-Man one that all the atheists throw around? You know it, right? Spider-Man is, what is it? Do you know it offhand?
I mean, just like the flying spaghetti monster or the Russell's teapot, that there's history of Spider-Man in the comic books and
right, and it doesn't mean Spider-Man's and like there are some contexts where a standard atheist talking point is perfectly legitimate. Okay, so let's put aside the idea of somebody operating bad faith. There are some contexts where a standard atheist talking point is perfectly legitimate. Usually it's based in reason, a reasonable idea or reasonable analysis. But then there are other contexts where it's totally false. And a lot of times the person on the other end of the conversation is unwilling to perceive the differences between those two because they aren't actually willing to do the critical thinking of their own position in that. Did that make sense, what I just said?
It does. And I think people are often reluctant to do that. So that's the job of having an open back and forth discussion. So what if you say to the person, listen, I hear what you're saying with that example, but here's what I think is implied by that example. Here's where I think, I think there are cases where that example can work, and I get that, but I think your example here doesn't work, and here's why. And you go, blah, blah, blah. Here's the reasons why. Think about that type of approach compared to, you're just in bad faith. You know what you're saying is wrong. You know it doesn't apply. And
right, but once the steamroller is in motion and the person is geared up in the steamroller way, it's really hard to break that cloud of.
Right.
That's why
it's
I
hard.
call it bad faith, because the person is perfectly capable if pulling away from the conversation and smart enough to know better and perfectly capable of reasoning it through in a way that's crystal clear to them, so that they understand the implications of how they are misappropriating a talking point and distorting the context wherein it would be accurate.
Well, first of all, like, what's my definition of bad faith is somebody who is intentionally, deliberately aiming to mislead in some way.
I throw in the reason why we're struggling over that word is because I use it to incorporate people who are semi-conscious of their behavior and being slippery and evasive, but it's somewhat innocent.
But
you
why
would probably think
so
them,
if it's
them innocent,
why? Yeah, if it's innocent, then why call it bad faith rather than bias?
Because they are perfectly capable of getting a hold of themselves and reasoning it through, and they know better, and they're not acting up to the standard of integrity that they say they are in a moment. So
okay, well, hold on.
By the way, something that I've almost never seen you do. By the way, never.
I appreciate that, but you've made some statements of, they're capable of knowing better and they should know better.
Yes, it's loaded language. It's loaded language. I'm the religious person, dude.
But the nature, there's two things. The nature of bias is very difficult to overcome. It's really hard to overcome bias.
Agreed.
Bias. So, and we all have bias, and often we think it's a lot easier to spot bias in somebody else than to spot it in yourself. So when you say they should know better, I see it as somebody who's just being human, who is succumbing to their natural biases, who either hasn't caught on or hasn't figured out a way to get around their biases. So, but think of, in terms, if our goal is to have a productive conversation, think of, we talked about principle of charity. Think of how it can change the conversation if our goal is productive conversation, to proceed as if they are biased. And I don't use bias as a negative in the sense of bias isn't a character flaw, or if it is, we all share this character flaw. It's not a mark of a bad person to be biased. I'm not talking about prejudice. That's different. I'm not talking about bias in the terms of prejudice. I'm talking about, bias, cognitive error.
Right. No, I totally understand.
Yeah. So think of how it changes the conversation to proceed as if the person is biased and is sort of stuck in a bias and can't get out, versus they know better. They know what they're doing. They're just not trying, and they're just doing this. They know what they should do. But I mean, the term cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
So it's that nagging feeling that something's wrong, that something is not supposed to be there. And what do we do instinctively most of the time when we have cognitive dissonance?
You tell me. I don't know where you're going with it. What do we do?
I think we give in. We give
What do you
into it.
mean?
We avoid it. Like, we don't fight that cognitive dissonance. We give in. We find a way to resolve it rather than push through it and find our way we find a way to make it okay. So we get rid of that dissonance. And usually it's by avoiding.
Right. Wait, explain how that is germane to what we just said.
Because
how does
I
that
think
relate to what we just
you're
talked about?
saying, I think what you're saying is sometimes people have that feeling that they may not be totally on point, but they don't, and they don't go the distance and do the right thing and resolve it, and work through it and
So is the
do it.
okay? Is this what you just said? Let me see if this is what you just said. So in other words, you're in a discussion with them, and they start to misuse something, and they kind of know they're doing it, and you start to call them on it, but they're incapable of drawing back from the edge in the course of the conversation.
Right.
They're incapable of course correcting in the moment because they've already committed to a position, so they can't be that self-aware in the moment. I'm perfectly I am
yeah.
perfectly content to let somebody slide. When I use charged language, I'm not using it I will give people 100 opportunities to walk away from that and correct themselves 1,000 times.
But it's
So
also,
I get,
but it's more than just giving somebody the opportunity. I think we have to recognize how hard it is, so I think we need to use methods. I think we need to use methodology to get beyond our biases. So when somebody's cognitive dissonance is triggered, when they're in that sense of heightened,
heightened awareness,
anxiety, or whatever, they have that feeling.
right?
One thing you need to do is help them get that feeling gone. So again, framing it in terms of, as soon as you accuse somebody of bad faith, what I think it does, if they think, if they know they're in bad faith, it doesn't. But if like normal, like I think most of the time, they don't think they're in bad faith. As soon as you accuse them of bad faith, it triggers an emotional reaction, which is going to more likely than not barrel down on whatever they were currently doing. They're going to probably double down on that.
Double down on it. Yeah, okay. I agree.
Get defensive.
I agree.
So part of what I'm trying to promote is we have to help each other get past our biases. We have to recognize that we each have biases and recognize some of the things that trigger those biases. So telling somebody, I think you're lying, or I think you're in bad faith, it almost inevitably, I think, triggers emotions that make things worse in terms of getting past that. I think there are ways to phrase things. Like, I understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. And I think there are times where that applies, but here's my problem with what you're saying. So rather than just going into the bad faith, just saying, here's my difficulty with what you're saying. What do you think of this? And then presenting it, rather than just saying, I think you're in bad faith. I think you know what you're doing. I think you know better than this. And, blah, blah, blah. I think there are ways to help each other in a productive conversation get past our own biases. It's not easy. Giving into your bias is easy.
Two questions based off what you just said.
Sure.
One, do you have an analogy so we can explore it? And two, have you started working on this methodology? Because I agree that there could potentially be a methodology where you could put it into play to ensure that conversations get somewhere in a productive way. That's kind of what you're saying, is you're trying to, right? That's kind of what this ultimately is about, correct?
Well, sure, and an example is this conversation we're having right now. Where I started by saying I understand the, for example, I understand the syndrome that you're talking about, with the atheist, or with this, with the and I understand, and I understand where this applies. But let me suggest another way of looking at it. So I did it in a way. I didn't just say, "Oh, you're just biased against atheists." I did it in a way that's designed to get to lower the bias and get around the bias. Like I'm talking about, doing an end run around our bias. And in terms of my method, like so I've come up with I've got 10 tips. It's actually 14, but to make it more
YouTube friendly.
Yeah, YouTube friendly. I've got it down to 10. So I'm working on a video now, and some of them I've talked about. But so, I mean, in terms of my method, I'm not talking about scientifically. Like these are anecdotally. I have developed, I've noticed patterns that I notice have hurt conversations. I notice patterns that seem to help. Like, for example, repeating back to the person, like what you just did to me. Let me see if I understand you. Let me see if I understand you, and repeat it back, and then I could say yes or no if that was what I meant. That is key. Right. And it's so rare that people do that. I mean, it's starting to become a little bit more common in some discussions. But any non-productive discussion, which is still the majority, like we didn't see a lot of, I was going to use I won't use a specific example, but it's very
Yeah.
rare that people
Yeah,
say,
don't use Stephanie and Scott.
yeah.
I felt you going there too. I'm like, no, that's okay.
Yeah. No, it's very rare that we see this. I mean, another tip I have: ask, don't tell. So often we have people in discussions tell the other person what they mean, rather than asking them what they mean. Questions are taken as rhetorical often. Most often the time when somebody asks a question, it's taken as a rhetorical argument. And that's not necessarily the best way to go. I mean, sometimes questions are rhetorical arguments, but I think we need to be asking more questions. Let me make sure I understand what you mean. Is this the implication of what you're saying? And so be prepared. I think we should be asking a lot of questions and being prepared to answer questions in return, right? Because so often we have these conversations go on and I can see it. Like I can see they don't understand each other. They are both talking about completely different things and they don't seem to realize it in the flow of the discussion. And if they stopped for a bit and just asked some questions to clarify,
those are two. What are some of the others? Ask questions, repeat back.
So I can go through. Yeah. So confirm your term. Yeah. Here, I'll go through them quickly. Confirm your term. Or I may confirm your term. I'm trying to get it to rhyme. John Buck made the suggestion for me to make them nice and pithy. So I'm trying. Confirm your term. So we already talked about this. Make sure that you understand that you understand what
talking about the same
by key terms. Right.
Okay. Go ahead.
Repeat to see if they agree. So often in these discussions, they're not, like you said earlier, they're not really talking with one another. And so just repeating back to the person has two functions. One is to make sure you understand, but two, it shows them you've been paying attention. If you can repeat back to them what they said, it shows that you've been listening. And I think that in itself lowers somebody's guard in the sense of it makes them feel validated. It makes them lowers their guard in the sense of antagonism towards you. It makes them feel more open to having a discussion with you because they feel validated. You are listening to me. That makes me want to talk to you more.
Yeah, it's fairly radical in Christian atheist survey. That in and of itself is a radical that makes the conversation 5,000 times more productive. Just listen to this stupid person. Listen to what they're saying. And
show them that you're listening. Let them know you're listening, not just nod, but show them by saying, here's what I hear you say.
The standard thing that happens is that most people, and this happens, they are listening for keywords, like you said, the keywords, but the keywords so that they can plug in their argument du jour. So they can plug in this counter argument or this counter. Oh, cool. He said morality. I'm now going to go,
that's right.
Old Testament, God is so immoral. I'm now going to go, now I'm going to plug in a go-to argument.
Exactly. Right. Well, that's it. Okay. So ask, don't tell. I already talked about this. When in doubt, ask questions and ask lots of them and be prepared to answer some in return. Next one, I talked about it briefly, engage, avoid rage. So it can be incredibly frustrating in the discussion when a party sets out a whole exposition and then the other party just brushes it off and then just moves on to their own points. So when somebody makes a point, respond to it. And don't just respond to the points that you think you have a ready response to. Respond to the point where it may be, saying, hey, I have to think about that some more. But reward the person for making an argument. Don't just brush it off. And if you don't understand it, ask questions about it. Next point, don't paint by numbers. So move beyond your talking points. If you're having, we all have talking points. We've all had some of the same discussions over and over and over again. So it's easy to get into the flow of just going through your talking points. But that's basically having a discussion on autopilot, and it rarely leads to a productive discussion. So get off your talking points. Concentrate and focus on what they're saying, and respond to what they're saying. If you're actually responding to what they're saying, you can't be using your talking points anymore. Because chances are your talking points aren't.
You got to be organic to the moment and be really paying attention to what's going on. So your talking points get forgotten and they get thrown out the window.
And you actually have a back and forth conversation.
Yeah, and ironically, if you come up with talking points in that moment, then those are actually usually much better talking points. So you
Right.
become
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, the whole goal of this is that it should improve your own arguments as well as theirs. Now,
Yeah.
I've got to come up with a new one for this, but John thinks it's a little too archaic. Be genteel, not a heel. I'm trying to come with dry
be
terms,
genteel, not a heel.
yeah, and in other words, be civil. I'm trying to make them pithy, but I'm going to work on that one. So it's not about being nice. A lot of people say, my method when I've talked, it's about I'm nice. It's not about being nice, although that could be a symptom of, like, not a side effect of it.
Right.
So it's about having productive conversations. So people think insults and invectives are part of internet talk, and it may be, but it's at cross purposes with having a productive discussion. As soon as you insult somebody or are rude to them, their attention is diverted from your point, and all the attention goes to the perceived insult or invective, right? And suddenly productive conversation, your odds of having a productive conversation are much worse.
Gone.
So
Yes.
so again, it's not about being nice. Like, it's not just, oh, I'm just a nice guy.
Being nice
No.
is weak. Being nice
Yeah.
is weak. It's lame.
It's having a
Nice.
productive conversation. So be careful with the insults. Now, that doesn't mean, like, I say like teasing can be good, but pure insults, you're an idiot, that kind of stuff.
Well, usually that only happens when it's once those things start happening, they come up automatically because it's degenerated into that stage, what I call the nanny poo poo stage, and then it's just like a free for all.
It's
because
true. Some people get very quick to it, especially on Twitter.
Yeah,
But,
of course. Well, that's part of the whole. I mean, that's why you're going to have to deal. I know you don't like the word bad faith, but you're going to have to deal with the whole. That people, a lot of times people are doing this. We'll finish and then we'll go into some counterpoints.
Well, yeah,
because I think a lot of times people are doing this because it's psychologically they're getting a charge out of it, and it's psychologically reinforcing themselves. I don't think they're so incapable of having civilized conversations. I think they just don't want to. That's
but they don't know. I don't think they don't know how, because I'll tell you, when you have a good productive conversation, there's a charge you get from that. Like, there's a thrill that you get from that, but most people haven't felt that because they don't have it. But like, when you have a good discussion and you leave it, you leave feeling great, right? And people just don't often have a sense of it, and they think that the insults give them, like, I don't know, maybe I'm projecting. I know when I do those insults, there's an initial feeling of, aha, I got him. But then I feel bad. I don't know if other people feel bad, but I feel bad.
When's the last time you got into a free for all? Just out of curiosity, where you started insulting someone, other than John Buck.
It's been a while. There was a time. Now, I've never been the full free for all, you're an idiot, but sometimes I do. For example, give in and make the snarky comment that I know is going to that's going to
ruffle some
provoke
feathers.
Ruffle feathers and do that. I'm generally pretty good at not doing it. Sometimes I give in. It's been over a year. Like, I took a year or so ago, I took a break from Twitter because I was getting very frustrated. The conversations I was in weren't having a good psychological effect on me. I took a 3 or 4 month break, and then I came back saying, with a big focus on having productive discussions and avoiding the discussions with the people who are just looking for insulting back and forth. And I'll say, listen, I don't block anyone. My block and mute list is empty, but I'll say, listen, that's not the kind of conversation I'm interested in, so I'm going to withdraw here. And
right.
And this goes back to actually a question you had said earlier. How do you enforce it? Well, you can't force people, but what we can do is say to somebody, listen, I want to have a good discussion with you, and I'm not interested in having the standard back and forth, us versus them, insult fest, and then just not have them.
Honestly, because that's what I do. I've gotten like maybe 5 Twitter feuds in the last 3 or 4 years, 2 of which you witnessed. But I don't get in that many of them. And usually when I'm in them, I will say to someone, this just isn't how I roll, and I'm not interested in this. Yeah. And that's why I never had to block anybody, because they'll come back twice, and I'm like, look, I'm really honestly not interested in doing this. I'm not saying I'm not interested. I'm not.
That's fair, right? I think we shouldn't reward the people who, like, a lot of times people just, there's a thread I was in, a big thread that I was in even for a couple years, and the thread had been going on for a couple years before that, and I have it muted
Couple
now.
of years? Did you say
Yeah, this
years?
thread has been going on for a long time, and between some
What?
theists and atheists, and even though I have the thread muted now because I don't want it in my notifications, it still comes across my feed from people, and I still see sometimes the same discussions, the same wording almost over and over and over and over and over, and like these same unproductive
Wow, who on
discussions.
earth
Like,
is in this thread?
yeah,
You don't you don't
I'll
have to
tell you
say it
off
publicly,
stream.
but yeah,
Yeah,
tell me off stream
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure. Tell me off
yeah.
stream, because I gotta know who that
It's
is.
been going on forever. Like again, I
So are
haven't been
these
in
like
it for a
pig-headed
year. So
atheists too? Or are these pig-headed
it's
Christians and
atheists and
atheists?
theists, and I think it's just
Are they
theists and
both being
atheists.
equally obstinate and
Yeah, like I mean, what I should do is, if I'm looking for fodder for one of the sub segments I want to do on my channel is sort of argument.
why these idiots
Yeah.
are arguing for
Well,
3
no,
years straight?
yeah,
Why these
basically
imbeciles
argument
arguing for
autopsy. Showing where arguments have gone off the rails and how they could have done differently. So that thread will actually be good, where these same conversations are going over and over again.
Now wait, before I ask you this question, have you done your list yet? Have I given you the whole list?
No, I still have a few others. If you want me to go,
Well,
go
if you can
through
put
them.
if you can remember to get to them.
Yeah.
How do we make these when we are talking theist atheist? How do we zero in on this to get to the real? Like, see what's interesting about you. Okay, you're in a chat that I lead on Saturday nights usually. That you're the only atheist in the chat, I think, or there's another guy now who I think's an atheist. But it never is ever an issue. Like, you easily float into, it's not like we're exactly going, we're all going like, I love Jesus, so do I, praise God, hallelujah. But like, you float easily in there without any, as far as I can see, any obstacle. The only time you went quiet was once. Do you know what I'm asking? What am I asking? How do you maintain that high? Because we're talking pretty intensely, and you're at a pretty high level conversation, where the main thorn of contention or bone of contention between someone like you and I never ever comes up. How do you manage to do what others can't? I guess.
I mean, this is what these steps are the things I've been using for like developing over the last, say, 10 years or so. I think is when I started the last decade. I think is sort of on my own and my own. I've been involved in internet discussions for a long time. I used to be involved in some internet discussions on a forum, on a pretty large forum that had a very active atheist, religion subforum. So atheist versus theist discussions. I spent several years active on a parapsychology forum, on where they go into the science of parapsychology, ESP,
oh, interesting. Okay,
telekinesis, cool. And so the skeptics versus the believers in that. So I've spent a lot of time, and then eventually I migrated over to Twitter in the last, say, 2 years, I guess. So I've had a lot of these conversations, thousands of these conversations over the years. And I think I've just noticed patterns. And also, I have a lot of training too in devil's advocacy. So I'm pretty good at putting myself at looking at, I really can't help it. I automatically start thinking of the opposite of any argument I start hearing. so I'm good at looking at things from both sides. But a lot of this stuff, like all these tips that I'm going through now, these are things that I've sort of learned slowly over the years and have been practicing over the years, and that I think that I consciously do. That I consciously like, and when I say consciously, I mean consciously. I mean, you have to think about these things when you're in these conversations. I don't think it just happens automatically.
Right. So in other words, this isn't just a mysterious coincidence. You have cultivated the type of personality that is able to sit in on a high level conversation with three theists where that never comes up, and you're able to talk about, granted, we're kind of discussing it all from your territory, sort of.
Right.
But it's
yeah.
something you've consciously cultivated over the years. It's not some sort of accident. It's something you've worked on a lot. That's
exactly.
Right?
It's not an accident. I'm not just better at it than other people, and I'm not.
Well, you might have started out. You might have started out with some. You probably were pretty easy to get along with
Yeah, my temperament is
growing
probably
up
that, but I have the same instincts. I have the same, that I think is an XDD comic. What are you doing? Why come to bed? No, this is important. What? Somebody's wrong on the internet. like
That's you.
I have that same instinct as anybody else. When I see something wrong, when somebody's snarky to me, I feel like punching back. Like I have all the same, and I have the
Right.
same.
Okay, but here's the
bias.
question. Here's the question. This will clarify. How combative are you in real life, and do you get in a lot of fights? Because I'll tell
No,
you,
I mean,
I'll give you
in
I'll
real
give you
life,
the
I play
answer
it. Sorry, go ahead.
in the last 15 years in real life, the only person I've ever fought with is my wife. Period. Get on no other arguments with nobody ever, except on Twitter. That's it. 5 on Twitter.
Yeah.
Nobody in real life. Never. How
No,
many fights do you get when you were a kid? It doesn't strike me as you were
didn't get
particularly
fights as
quarrelsome.
a kid,
What?
but I never got in. I think I've only been in one like physical fight in my whole life. But like I was always able to
Arguments with people at work and
Yeah.
stuff. I'm
Well,
guessing not a lot.
No, I mean with my ex-wife, I guess, yeah. But
Yeah, well, that's different.
no, at work I've always been sort of the mediator.
Right. That's
More
what I'm
than
guessing. That's what I said.
yeah.
So you're
But
naturally inclined towards this role in real life
but that
without this.
probably a
Go
little
ahead.
bit more than other people. But that being said, I don't think much of this is natural. I think it's about working it over and over and over again. And it's about practicing, right?
Right.
It's about just doing it consciously. Like when I go through these, I mean, okay, some of it's more second nature than normal. But a lot of it is I have to stop, pause. I rewrite tweets. It's harder in a live conversation, right? So I'll with the back and forth. But I'll rewrite sorry, rewrite tweets, a few times sometimes, before, when I realize, that's a little too harsh. I know what that's going to happen there. It's about methodology. It's not about, again, we all have these biases, and I have the same us versus them biases as anyone else. It's just what these tips, and I still have a few others, but what a lot of these
feel
tips,
free to bring them up as they.
Sure. Well, a lot of my goal, like my hypothesis is we can't get rid of these us versus them biases, but we can trick them. So a lot of these techniques are geared at making you see them a little more like us. And what it does, I think, is it reduces that natural anxiety we have about the other, because the us versus them bias, the tribal bias, is deep. It's old. It's been there since before we were human. And, back when the other tribe or the other group of animals or whatever was really trying to kill you. And even in humanity, when there's wars and whatnot, when there really are, the other is really trying to kill you and steal your stuff. And so it's deep. And I think it gets triggered anytime we perceive somebody as the out group. We have a natural affinity to the in group and a natural distrust of the out group. And it applies in all these conversations, just like it applies, in a war. Now, in a war, when you're in a war, you want to have that tribal bias is going to save your life, right?
Right.
Better be careful. Better not trust the other side, because they'll kill you. In a discussion, it serves at a cross purpose. And so a lot of this is trying to trick it. Another one is I say become the other. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. This is what I do a lot. I ask myself, if I believed what the other person believed, what would naturally follow from that? How would they see me? How would they if I believe
Right,
what
but
the other person
that's the Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul gave that advice in the scriptures. I become like all people so that I might win some. That's exactly how a Christian is supposed to evangelize, by breaking bread with people and having peace and establishing rapport. And then the evangelism comes naturally. It just sort of organically flows. But go ahead.
It's that by putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And now I'm not just saying think what does the other person think. I'm saying literally put yourself in the other person's shoes. If I believed what they believe,
if I were them, I said that to somebody once, because that's exactly why I don't really have any big trip on atheists because I've heard enough of their stories, and I can easily imagine. Well, if I was raised as a fundamentalist Christian in that strict of an environment, I would start doing almost exactly what that person did, and I'd probably come to those conclusions and those conclusions, and I'd get almost up to the point where they got. I don't know if I'd go full blown atheist and start making these evil YouTube videos, but I'd go very far down the path that they gone, and I'd see things almost the exact same way up to a point. Like there's a lot of it that I make sense to me completely. Like I get it. I would have done the same
and then
thing.
you start to think
Or
of them
similar.
less as having. Don't you start to think of them as less in bad faith when you do that?
Well, the people I'm accusing of bad faith, I mean, I always differentiate this when I bring up atheists in my videos. There are go-to atheists who I always bring up, like Paul Gia, Drew, Objectively Dan will be on my channel next week, Shannon, who don't operate in bad faith, or almost never. There's another type of atheist out there who I call the douchebag atheists, and they almost always operate in bad faith. And to call them to recognize them as such isn't, to me, a defect in my people sizing up abilities. There's tons of atheists. I would never accuse you of operating bad faith. Why? Because you never do. It's not rocket science, because you don't. So I never accuse you.
Let me throw this out, though. Let me throw this out. Be careful about confusing being a douchebag with being in bad faith. There are a lot of people who are douchebags, but they have convinced themselves that they are fighting the good fight. And so it's easy to see
that's a really interesting, useful conversation. So go ahead, but I'm not sure if it's the same conversation. Go ahead. Go.
But yeah, and I don't think you do this, but a lot of people do this. A lot of douchebags do this. And you see a lot of people say, well, I give what I receive. And what people think is when the other side does it, they are unjustified. So when they do it, they're nefarious, they're in bad faith, they're unjustified. When we do it, we are fighting the good fight. We're telling it like it is. It's tough love. We're just standing up for what's right. And each side tends to be the same, or use different language, and they act like douchebags to each other. But being a douchebag, sometimes people believe that is being forthright and fighting the good fight.
No,
and
totally correct. I never do it. When I say people operate in bad faith, though, I never generally give back what I get. It's only personal and it's only specific. So it's only based on your behavior. So if you're acting like a douchebag to me, I'll give it right back to you 100 times.
Well, but let me ask you.
If you're cool with me, I'll have no problem with you. I don't care what you believe underneath it all. I base off of your behavior. So if you're cool to me, 100 times out of 100, I'm cool right back. Doesn't make any difference what you label yourself as or what you believe, in your twisted
but when
little
you talk about the behavior,
in your twisted little world,
are there questions you could ask the other person to probe to figure out if they're really in bad faith or not?
Maybe, but I'm not necessarily saying that I'm not using bad faith the same way you are. I'm saying the person's being a douchebag. Period.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, yeah,
they're using atheism. They're using atheism, and this could be anybody. They're using atheism as a cloak to act like a douchebag and get away with it. And it's what douchebags do. And it could easily be a Christian doing the exact same thing, because I've seen them do it. They're using the underlying ideology to cause pain, to humiliate, to try and humiliate, and that's what they are actually enjoying, not the underlying ideas. It's not about the commitment to the
but just pause
ideology.
on that. Just pause on that. So you focused on that their goal is to cause pain.
Right.
Now I'm not going to doubt that there are some people like that, but I will suggest that, because I've had private conversations with some of these so-called douchebags, and I'm pretty sure that they think they're fighting the good fight, not that they're not trying, that their main goal is not to cause pain, but they feel that they're fighting a battle, and this is how they do it. Now, I'm not justifying it. I think it's poor behavior, and I'm pretty vocal about talking out against it, because I think it's completely unproductive. But I don't think it necessarily, not always. Sometimes, again, there are trolls who just want to cause pain. But I still think most of these quote unquote douchebags, their goal is good. They see themselves as good. They're just doing it in a maybe not so great way.
Maybe, but there's a point where and Christians can do this too. This isn't about atheism. There's a point where your ideology can blind you to how you are actually behaving. And the people on the receiving end of your destructive behavior are calling it a lot more forthrightly for what it is than you, in fact, are willing to own up to. So they think they're being righteous and fighting the good fight. And I'm sure they justify it to themselves that way. But that doesn't mean that the person on the receiving end of the behavior agrees with them. They think they're
No, of
being
course not.
evil
Yeah.
and destructive and horrible.
Right.
And you
each
should
side
recognize.
thinks the other. Yeah. Each side
Right, but I'm
sees
not
the
talking
other, and it's
sides.
almost the
That's
same
why I
way.
only judge it personally. I'm not talking
Yeah.
sides. Like I said, there's
Well,
a bunch
I-
of atheists who I get along with
Yeah.
really easily without any of that. So it's not about atheists. It's about evil douchebags, period.
Yeah.
Evil douchebags cloak their behavior. And they Hitler and Himmler didn't go, this is great, we're so evil. They didn't recognize that they were evil. They didn't go, this is really good, we're evil people. Yeah, we really are. They thought that they had justifications for their atrocities too. Do you see what I'm saying? So
Right.
there's a point.
So the question then is, what is the most effective way at getting that behavior to change? One, I mean, I think just, I mean, for one thing, I agree that when I'm against something like that, I say, listen, I'm willing to talk to you, but I'm not willing to have this kind of conversation. So if this is what you want, I'm not interested. So that's one way, not to combat it, but maybe to not reward it.
Right.
Another way I think though is to say, hey, listen, I think I hear what you're saying here. Is this what you're saying? And is this why, is this what you're saying? Not this is what you're saying. Is this what you're saying? And do you think we could maybe just calm it down a little bit and just have a good back and forth discussion? Like, I think there are things that we can say.
Right, but doesn't the person sometimes say no? No.
Sure. And then you can say, but we're never going to reach everybody. Not everybody's cut out to have productive conversations. That's just the reality. It's
Okay.
not for everyone. And that's, the goal is not to have a productive conversation with everybody, or at least that's not the expectation. There are a lot of people who aren't ready for it, who aren't interested in it, and so be it. The goal, I think, is to find people who are interested in having these conversations and to show people that they can have these conversations and actually really enjoy them.
So you're only going for people who want to do this, and okay, I got you.
And to show people.
What are the ones?
So I have one: be brave, don't evade. Doesn't quite rhyme, but sort of, it's close enough. Respond to every part of somebody's argument, not just the easy parts. I talked about this earlier. A lot of the times when we're in a discussion, somebody makes a point that just gives you that uncomfortable feeling, and it tells you there's something off with your argument. And what happens most of the time when people get this uncomfortable feeling, they rush right by it and respond to the point of the argument that they think they can respond to. And I think this is something where we have to be our own. We have to work on our own biases. This is about biasing ourselves. When you notice that internal feeling of cognitive dissonance, that's the time when you have to say to yourself, there's something wrong. Now, it doesn't mean that your argument is necessarily wrong, but it means there's something you have to work on. So rise to the challenge. Don't just throw it off, but don't avoid the hard parts, because those are the parts, that's where the productive conversation can really take place. Really get into them. Recognize there's either a problem with my own view that I have to change, or I need to revamp my view, and make it better. So people are always afraid of the trap. I'm a big fan of the Socratic style of argument, where you ask a series of questions to lead somebody down the garden trail. And I really like that type of argument. But a lot of people are very afraid of the trap. And I'll say, welcome the trap. Don't be afraid of the trap. Either you're going to get caught in it and you're going to realize your argument just has a lot of problems and you need to change it, or you're going to find a way out of it and make your argument even better. So just welcome the trap. Don't avoid.
I'm not convinced on that one, because a lot of times the trap is being laid inauthentically. The trap isn't a legitimate trap. It's not, here, let me point out the contradictions in your position. It's, here, let me inauthentically gotcha you, so that it looks like I really gotcha'd you on an authentic contradiction of your position, but I didn't. So I'm
Oh,
not
listen,
I'm not entirely
somebody can
convinced on
make that point, and then I understand exactly what you're saying, and people try to do that, but that's again part of what I'm saying is also in the context of where both parties are trying to have a productive conversation. But even in that, I would go so far as to say, even in the case where you think the other party is being a little bit disingenuous, I still think there's value in saying, I'm not afraid of your trap. I'm either going to get out of it or I'm going to fall into it and I have to change my position. Even if they are not being, that's where you get out of the us versus them. If part of my goal is to improve my own arguments, well, again, seeing where you get into that trap is still going to be a valuable experience to you. Now, if you're with somebody who's not like, again, if the other person isn't going to let you talk and isn't going to let you explain why you think they're wrong that they fell in the trap. Like if someone just goes, ha ha ha, I got caught and hangs up, well, the conversation's over anyway. But presuming the conversation is going to go forward, you should be able to say, here, I hear what you're saying, and I think this may be a weakness here, but here's my response to it, and so on. I think it's worth experimenting. I've tried to do this myself, and I think it's done well, where I just haven't worried about the trap. Sometimes I'll explain more. I won't necessarily just say, if someone just wants me to say yes or no answers, I'm not going to do that. I'll answer. I'll say yes or no, but I'm also going to give a more nuanced explanation. But part of this is about also using each other to help us challenge our own biases. So if each party, so we're all biased, so I say battling bias together, it's so much easier to spot our own biases. But if we can go into a discussion saying, you say beforehand, listen, let's each help the other, get past our biases, and just try not to take it so personally when the other party suggests you've caught yourself in a bias. Use each other. So if one side's feeling cognitive dissonance, it's okay to say, hey, are you feeling cognitive dissonance there? Is this a point we should dig into more?
Right. What are the we're starting to run out of time. So what are the
I think that's I think I went over
all
most of them. I think I pretty well hit all of them. A last sort of bonus one would be, don't give up too early. A lot of people in conversations very quickly get to where they say, let's agree to disagree. Now, I agree that there is a point in the conversation where you have to do that, where you're just spinning your wheels. But so often I've seen people on the verge of maybe having a breakthrough. And that's where they
okay, but what constitutes a breakthrough in atheist Christian relationships? What constitutes a breakthrough?
Well, I would say this goes back to we didn't talk about this as much, but because I only went through the first one. But I'll quickly go through my five areas of what I think a productive discussion is. So level 1, parties better understand one another. Level 2, parties are better able to identify where they agree with one another, because parties often don't spend enough time acknowledging where they agree with each other. Number 3, parties are able to identify and zero in on where they disagree. Number 4, parties are able to press forward into the areas in which they disagree. And part 5, criteria 5, parties are able to reach a resolution or identify a legitimate impasse. So so each of those sort of builds on the other, and each of those is deeper than the other. So I see often, for example, parties seem to be on the verge of really understanding one another, of really zeroing in on the issue, like the core issue of what they're getting at, because often we start very broadly, but often they're so close. They've been asking each other questions, and if they just spent a little more time, I can see that they could just reach at least a meeting of minds in terms of understanding one another where there was a lack of understanding, or, or stop talking past one another, or just any of these 5 criteria, moving from one level to the next. And so often I think people are very quickly, and this is because I think, they're just on talking points. So if all you are on talking points, then sure, there's not much to do. You have to get off those talking points. To get to each of these levels, I think you have to go through a lot of the tips that I've talked about. You've got to get off those talking points. You've got to get past the us versus them. It's about exploring things together, getting beyond the just, I have to win. But, like I don't think it's a productive conversation when one party wins. I think it's a productive conversation when they better understand one another, when, for each of these 5 levels, right? And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, even if ultimately your goal is to win, even if ultimately your goal is strategic, these things will help you develop better arguments to ultimately carry the day. If your goal is to
Yes.
Be an evangelist for one side or the other, ultimately this is going to help you succeed because you're going to quickly blow past the irrelevant impasse.
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
a lot of the impasses that people get bogged down in are totally and completely and utterly irrelevant, and they aren't even worth discussing. And then there's the core impasse, which is actually probably fundamental and key. And there may not be a way around the core impasse. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and you've been in discussion with me. I push my view. When I have a view, I push it forward, and I
Well, but
press
the one
into
thing
it.
about you that observation about you that, and we can talk about this in times to come, but you don't seem particularly evangelical about being an atheist, which is no problem with me. I don't mind. You don't have to try to convince me, but that's why I see some atheists listening to you and going, I'm not sure if that's for me. Why? Because they're trying to win ground. They're trying to they're actually trying to take position. And I don't see you as really doing that. I'm not criticizing it at all. I don't think you should be.
Well, here it is. I think
you have a lot more integrity than most people. And I think you're honestly trying to find the truth. Hello? That's what you're using to get to really figure out what you think, figure out what you know, clarify, and ultimately get at things that are true. That's what I think you're really trying to do, right?
And one thing I think to have a productive conversation, I think requires some risk. You have to risk having your mind changed. And that can be very scary for me or for anyone. So I think, and it can create cognitive dissonance, but that's part of what it is. And part of these things, like especially in the biases, that's why I say don't evade the problem, the areas that give you cognitive dissonance. There's risk involved. And if both parties are willing to risk themselves to the other, I think it makes for a much more collaborative,
right. But that's not
beneficial.
You're not being evangelical about being an atheist at all. Like Matt,
I'm not.
Stuff that you were talking about, I totally agree with it in terms of having productive conversation. But it is the exact opposite of what like Matt Dillahunty will do when he gets a phone call on the Atheist Experience. Exact opposite. He will quickly try to push that person off of what they're trying to tell him. Do you know what I mean? There's a strategy at play that's evangelical in ultimate. That's ultimately evangelical.
Yeah, I mean, I think we still can have productive conversations with more evangelical people, but I agree that like when dealing with an evangelist from any position, there's going to be a point where they're not often going to be willing to risk diving into their own views because of the bias. But I see it more as a bias issue than a nefarious.
Well, the only reason I'm pointing it out is it's just an observation about you. It doesn't seem to be your
No, I
goal
appreciate that.
at all. It doesn't.
Yeah, no, it's not. And
I think you take that as a compliment. I'm just saying that not all atheists think that way. Some of them see their goal as convert somebody to make, they'll quickly bring up, start trying to steer you into, by the way, God isn't real, you know what I'm saying? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and again, I'm not, none of what I'm saying isn't about not pushing forward your own view, but it's to do it in a productive manner. So, and it's also, and I think it's like this is one weakness I think a lot of atheists have, especially the lack of belief atheists who believe that they don't have a burden of proof. And I think they're wrong on that. That's maybe a different conversation, but I think a productive conversation has to be a two-way street. If you believe the only person who has to give answers is the other side, it's not likely to be, unless it's an interview, like if you're interviewing somebody, putting that aside. But in a discussion, if you just think the only one who has to answer to me is them and I don't have to answer to them, it's not going to be a productive, you're not likely to have a productive discussion because you're not risking anything yourself. You're not giving up anything of yourself. You're not putting anything on the table. And so I think if you're really confident in your position, you should be willing to put it on the table. And if you're not confident in your position, you should be even more willing to put it on the table because you should want to, if we want to press into our into our position.
Let me ask you a weird question, but
Sure.
it's kind of germane. How confident are you in your position? Would you say you're a soft atheist, but in terms of how much do you really think you're right? Would you say almost 100%? Or
No,
you
I mean,
kind of
first of all, I don't like. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
well, are you kind of you're not an atheist who's thinking of being a Christian, right? You're not, so you're not on the fence. I don't know. I think I'm not really clearly saying what I'm trying to ask you, but I think you
Yeah.
get the question.
Yeah, my point of view. I mean, like I said at the beginning, my point of view is that there is insufficient evidence, reliable evidence, to justify the proposition.
Well, let me tell you why I
that-
asked you.
Yeah.
Maybe that will help understand why I asked you. Because in my experience, a general observation, this could be wrong, but I see this a lot. The people who are the most ideological and aggressive in your face is actually paradoxically the least confident in their position. The people who are most like you, who don't really care if other people become atheists, doesn't seem to me like you really care if other people become atheists. And no offense, I mean that as a compliment.
Yeah.
You seem to be totally comfortable and at peace with their own position and actually really strong in it.
Yeah, well, I guess what I'm much more comfortable, like I think my basic, and I'll answer the other part, but my basic assumption is that most of the time, we have far more in common than we have differences. So we have theists and non-theists, atheists and Christians, and I still think we have more in common than we have differences. There's some key issues that lead to big differences. I would like us. I find there being value in diversity of thought, because I am pretty sure that none of us have figured out wham bam 100% nailed it. None of us have nailed it. There are pros and cons and weaknesses, pros and cons to any position. There are strengths and weaknesses to any worldview. I'm assuming I have some things figured out and other things not figured out. I assume that there are benefits to my point of view and weaknesses. I like the fact that there are different points of view. Wouldn't want a world where we all believe the same thing. That being said, I still think
you're trying to learn when you interact with people. You're not trying to assert. You're trying to learn.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I have the same inclination as anyone to try to convince somebody that I'm right, but I'm also open to the fact that I'm wrong. So I also want to know if I'm wrong. So one of the things that I want to do is put my ideas to the test. I think better sometimes in a dialogue. So I like throwing my arguments out there and letting people critique them, and then trying to answer each and every response, right? That's how I like to test my ideas, right? So I want constructive critique. I welcome constructive critique. I don't welcome the insults, but I like constructive critique because I want to challenge. I'm a skeptic. I want to challenge my own view. I'm always open to the fact that I'm wrong. So however confident I'm, I lean far more towards the non-belief side than the belief side, but I'm open to the fact, like, there are stuff that make me pause. There is, I think, relatively weak evidence, but
don't go too deep into that, because 2 weeks from now we're doing my questions.
Yeah, yeah. We'll have, okay, so we'll have another conversation on that. But basically, I'm open. I think being open-minded. Everybody thinks they're open-minded, or not everybody. A lot of people think they're open-minded, but I think being open-minded means actively. John Vervaeke talks about active open-mindedness. Means actively going out and trying to spot your own errors and putting yourself
also working to try to see everything from the point of view of the other person, to challenge yourself. I mean, a lot of the things that you work on consciously, I kind of do too. Prior to Trump taking office, I used to cross-reference every show I'd watch like the opposite point of view. Now CNN has become useless, so I don't watch them anymore, because it's all, I hate Trump, I hate Trump, I hate Trump. Do you like Trump? No, I hate Trump, I hate Trump, around the clock. But I used to always cross-reference with them to see to try and get, and I try to get like a conservative point of view on the news, like what Rachel Maddow says, someone who's kind of in the middle, like Anderson. So I try to always cross-reference and then think about it from a bunch of different ways to try to, that's an automatic thing with me. That's something I've been doing constantly.
Yeah. And a lot of
It
people
tends-
don't do that.
No, they do
And-
the exact opposite. They try to undergird and reinforce their own biases or their own leanings towards this, because they're trying to take ground for their, they're trying to take ground.
I find echo chambers very boring. I get bored very easily when I'm just talking with people who agree with me on everything. I think it's much more useful to have conversations with people. I mean, I still like talking to people who I agree with, but I really like conversations where there's a diversity of views. That's much more interesting than just.
Yeah, I totally
agreement.
agree. I'm usually the same way. That I'll get, because you know the lay of the land really quickly within the context of your own echo chamber. You start to know exactly what someone's going to say on a given subject, because they become a by the numbers like conservative, and okay, they're going to say this about this, and you're
Right.
usually right. They're going to believe this about this and this, and there starts
And
to become
they're going to hate each other.
Democrat.
And part of what I'm trying to promote is you can disagree with people, even fundamentally, and still get along with them, still live and work with them. That's what I'm trying to get past, that us versus them bias, which means let's welcome diversity of thought. Let's push our views. I push my view aggressively too. Like I don't give in. I'm as stubborn as anyone. But I don't have to hate you because you believe something different from me. And you don't have to hate me because I believe something different. And frankly, much of the time, our disagreements, our beliefs are actually much more similar than they are different. Like I think a lot of theists have a hard time seeing atheists as being moral creatures, but but I think very often or on the other times atheists will say, oh, you've just taken our type of morality, you've taken theistic morality. But I think the reality is a lot people are people, and we do have a lot more in common, even if we have different ideologies and we have different languages for often saying very similar things. So it's not surprising that we're going to come to similar conclusions on, say, morality, with some big exceptions, but overall, I think we have much more similarities on morality than we do differences, and we don't need, and if we can understand where somebody's coming from, we can maybe say, yes, they have a different moral view from me, but I get where they're coming from, and so at least I understand it, even if I disagree.
Right. So on that note, we're going to have to bring it to a close.
Sure. This has been great.
Any last things you want to say before we sign off? Because I want to chat with you a few minutes before I go upstairs.
So just my channel is Pleasure of Doubt on YouTube, and there aren't a ton of videos there, but just released
this is going to go on there, right? You're going to post this.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig. I'm going to upload this to it, and I'm going to be making a more structured video which goes over a lot of. So I've already released a video which went over my five criteria. It's not long; it's about 6, 7, 8 minutes long, and I'm going to be having another video which hopefully I'm going to up the production value a bit. I'm just getting used to this. The scripted videos are a challenge. It's sometimes easier just to chat like we are, but I'm trying to do a scripted video on my my discussion techniques that we sort of went over briefly here. So this was sort of another trial run.
Now, what'd you think of this conversation? It was productive.
Oh, this is great. What's that? Sorry?
It was productive, correct?
Yeah, very productive. Yeah, no, this was great. And that's part of what I want to show, that we can have productive discussions. A theist and an atheist or non-theist can, we'll have to have a conversation on non-theism. Can have these discussions and get along, and I want to show people that you can do this, and they don't have to have these acrimonious discussions, among people with different views.
Amen. Amen and amen. Did you hear that, kids? And give me the tithes. And with that, John, are you going to sign us off for the night? Are you going to?
Yeah, sure thing. I just got a comment from. No, that's good. I was just going to say that JB was frustrated because, he's saying you're running away from him, Craig.
I told him he could come on. I told you to send him a link.
He said you're running away. I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe next week he'll be able to.
Did he not come on, or did you send him a link? And how am I running when I invited him on the channel?
I don't know how, but somehow you're running away.
All right. Well, yes, I'm scared of JB. I admit this. I mean, should I run away? If somebody keeps saying you're running away, it makes me think maybe I should run away from you. You know,
he just talked to a dry apologist on his channel, and dry apologist now is an agnostic. So maybe you should.
Cool.
All right, yeah, I'll go ahead and end the stream for you. But we got quite a few people in the chat, but you can read it over later if you want.
I didn't see any chat. Something must have been wrong. Oh, I didn't refresh. I probably had to refresh.
Yeah.
I saw no chat.
Yeah.
Maybe
we had
wrong, or am I in the wrong stream?
Anyway, probably in the wrong stream. Craig made a couple. All right. Good night, everybody.
All right. Have a good night.
Good night, all.